fairly low levels of traded volume. Vietnam's prices have drifted a little bit lower. We were seeing that 2 weeks ago, and we've continued to see that, although the market hasn't tested any new lows, and it is stable somewhere around 285 to 295 FOB for 320s. Now, there are many processors looking for more money, and that's either because it's forward or they have excellent quality or because they're highly reliable, and that's not surprising. And there are some that are lower than 285. So there's no doubt you will see a lower price, but a lower price comes with a risk. I think what we've actually seen over the past, probably last 3 to 4 weeks in Vietnam is a kind of an overreaction or a knee-jerk reaction, as we might say, to a quiet market and financial pressures within the sector. So what I'm suggesting is that maybe the lower prices in Vietnam are not actually driven by international market factors, but by domestic factors in the cashew sector in Vietnam. Meantime, in West Africa, prices for kernels remain quite steady. We're seeing international trade between $3.10 and $3.20. Again, you will hear lower prices reported. And again, there is a two-tiered market developing. So you are finding some plants unable to carry out their own marketing, are finding it easier just to resell to their competitors or to traders, and that market, naturally enough, is a little bit lower. And therefore, you see a wide spread. So you will see reports below 310 in West Africa, but it's often businesses that are struggling themselves to make the exports. Prices in Brazil remain steady. Brazil is well advanced in their processing of the 2021-22 crop, and I wouldn't expect any change there. If we look a little bit further downstream, and now we're talking about consumers, we're talking about roasters, supermarkets, what's happening with the product. We're seeing that the Indian demand is pretty steady. Prices are pretty steady as a result. There is an expectation that big seasonal demand will kick into the market probably from July. Don't forget that there are major festivals in India, September, October, November, and those have a huge influence on demand for cashew kernels. If we look at exports and shipping as an indicator of demand, we see that Vietnamese exports have continued quite strong right up to the end of May. In fact, if we extract China's figures, which were largely reduced due to the COVID-19 restrictions on the Vietnam-China border and within China itself, we would actually find that exports are up on last year. So the difference that China makes is from 4% down to just under 1% up in the January-May period. Now, the Chinese market is important in that period, but as the year goes on, it eases a little bit in terms of its importance. The other market where imports are down is the Netherlands. Having said that, we are still seeing quite positive figures for shipments to all European countries. And we're not seeing any real, with the exception of the Netherlands, we're not seeing any real drop back in shipments to Europe. So talk of a collapse of European demand is, I'm afraid to say, just complete nonsense. We're reading that in a lot of places. And it just does not appear to be borne out by the facts right to the end of May. Meantime, in the US, we see a pretty strong situation in terms of imports. Imports are strong up to the end of April. And if we look at shipments from Vietnam during May, I think it was 14,400 tons. It looks set to continue. So US demand remains strong, the evidence being the world's largest grower of cashew nuts. We are seeing that prices have drifted down a little bit, mostly, as is usual for this time of year, mostly on lower quality. There is healthy trade between local buyers who are holding in warehouses and the exporters, and processors continue to buy. I'm hearing estimates of between 160 and 180,000 tons to be processed in 2022. I wouldn't be surprised if it exceeds those numbers. We've a couple of major factories have opened in the last 12 months, and they will be active, and prices are pretty attractive if you're buying local raw cashew nuts and processing them locally. The last figure for exports, I've heard about 350,000 tons. And there has got to be a question now, as our guest last time pointed out, as to whether the crop will reach the original estimate of 1.04 million tons. It seems to me unlikely to reach the 1 million tons mark. Still the largest crop in the world, still a pretty good crop, still better than last year, but just not up to those original estimates. And that may well have an influence on the supply and demand balance as the year goes on. Moving on to Mali, prices remain steady. The crop here is almost at an end. The official figure for exports right now is 136,000 tons, which seems a big number to me, but let's hope it's right. It's a difficult time for the industry in Mali, but the season there appears to be winding down. If farmers have raw cashew nuts, if they have any quantity of raw cashew nuts, they're able to sell them pretty easily. Looking at Guinea, again, we have the problem perhaps of early rains right across the region. Quantity is drying up now. The farm gate prices are falling based on lower quality. We do see material coming into the country from Guinea-Bissau, probably from Mali too, and maybe even from Cote d'Ivoire. Offers, we hear around $12.50 cost and freight. I'm not so sure about that. I'm pretty sure that's not been paid right now. I'm not so sure if there isn't one or two lower offers around. Again, obviously depending on the quality. So when we look at our price table for raw cashew nuts on a cost and freight basis from West Africa this week, we see just about everywhere price has fallen in the international market. It's fallen in a number of cases due to lower quality, as in the case of Ghana, for example. But in others, I think sellers perhaps have corrected some of their over-ambitious offers as they look at a relatively quiet market and they want to start to move some material. That's the situation in the Nigeria to Guinea range, if we want to call it that. Let's have a look a little bit more closely at the news from those countries that are just beginning or at the start, at least, of their harvest cycle for 2022. And we're talking there about Guinea-Bissau, the Gambia, and Senegal. Feature across the region is that rains have come a little bit earlier. That will have an impact. It can have an impact logistically. It can have an impact on the quality of the raw nuts, given the difficulty of drying. It can possibly affect the volumes available, although generally harvest forecasts are very good. Focusing on Guinea-Bissau to begin with, estimate of the crop around about 230,000 tons, which would be a pretty good crop, I think. I'm told there's about 35% of that in, which means in the warehouses. There's probably more that's moved across the border, which is smuggled or illegal trade into Senegal, into Guinea perhaps. But certainly the crop is moving on. Prices are steady, demand is strong. I don't think there's anything that's available for shipment that's not been bought up at the moment. And the beginning of the resolution of the logistical issues, the issuing of export licenses, bulk vessels coming to port, and the first container shipments are in sight, if not happening this week. I think what we are seeing, though, is that the structural problems with the infrastructure are again highlighted. And again, we're probably looking at slower shipments from Guinea-Bissau, which is an important supplier both to India and to Vietnam of raw cashew nuts. Although perhaps this year, maybe Guinea-Bissau will again switch back and be more important for Indian buyers than for Vietnamese. It was at one time almost exclusively selling to Indian buyers. In the last 3 or 4 years, that shifted to about 50-50. That may shift back again this year, but worth keeping an eye on. Looks like a good crop, looks like good demand. Frustrated perhaps by very high freight cost, difficult logistics problems, and probably slow shipments, which actually is a problem that appears to be dogging the Senegalese cashew sector too. Again, our reporters indicate about 50,000 tons available, arrived. Some of that may well be from Guinea-Bissau. Farm gate prices started the season, as you'll have heard us say here, starting 4 weeks ago, that farm gate prices started very high this year. They have eased in the meantime. I wouldn't say that they've fallen to a level that would impact the international price of RCN, just that they've come into line with that. But again, the difficulty is that containers are moving slowly or not moving at all. And that's leading to a situation where I think there are ready buyers for high quality raw cashew nuts like that comes from Senegal or from Guinea-Bissau indeed, but it's moving slowly and the costs are having a big impact. And finally, the Gambia, the smallest producer in the region. Again, there seem to be slower arrivals, but export shipments are ongoing. Prices are steady, and the port at Banjul is operating reasonably well. It's always a difficult port. Looking at the situation, I think we can probably expect that this cross-border trade that we've talked about many times on this and other events is going to be a big feature again this year. If you have bottlenecks at the ports, if you have highly regulated sectors, the two things tend to combine and people naturally look for other opportunities with that illegal trade following. So that's the situation in Africa. Again, not a great deal of change over the past 2 weeks. It still looks as if the crop will be a pretty good crop, but less than forecast, certainly less than hoped for earlier in the year, down to weather conditions. And I guess that's something that, looking to the future, we should get used to, because we're certainly looking at difficult climate change challenges ahead, which may favor cashews, but may make life a little bit less predictable. So there are some causes for concern. The early rains have not been helpful. Cross-border trade is happening, and that makes it a little bit more difficult to track exactly what's going on. Prices in this region range around $1,650 cost and freight to $1,700, I would say, asking prices now. We'll see how that develops over the coming weeks. Less room for negotiation in this area because the higher freight rates are really impacting hard on the ports of Bissau, Ziguinchor, and elsewhere in this region. That's the current market situation. I want to turn my attention, and yours, I hope, toward cashew kernels prices now and what's been happening really for the last 2 years. We don't have all the answers, so we just want to see if we can explore a better understanding of how cashew kernels prices have evolved, and particularly the impact of the lower prices that we've seen from Vietnam. So let's first of all try and establish exactly where we are historically in terms of cashew kernel prices. So you can see on the screen, I hope, the chart of 320s prices over the past 20 years, in fact. And you can see that, yeah, we live in a pretty volatile market. You can see that prices have ranged, well, if you go back far enough, around about $2, up as high as almost $5 in that big boom during August 2017. If we look at the trend, you can see that over the period, the general trend in 320 prices was pretty strongly upward. That's been interrupted. So you see the price line way below the trend line in the last 3 years. And what we need to answer is that really just the impact of the pandemic? Is it something else? And when we look at prices, we can just see that the lows of the last 2.5 years or so bring us back to 2009. So for the whole period of 2009 through to early days of 2020, prices were above the current price level. Why is that? What does it mean? Let's focus in on this period to see if we can get any clues as to what's been happening. So first of all, let's have a look at what I'm just calling the kernel's price puzzle. And we look at 3 areas. We look at the level of pricing. We look at some figures and some facts on demand. And we look at processing and what's been happening in processing. If we look at prices, first of all, as I've said, to nail it right now, today, prices in Vietnam, the dominant and lowest price origin, are about 5% off the 10-year lows. They've been yo-yoing between around about $2.80 and $3 over the past 3 months, and effectively, similarly in periods at the beginning or the first half of 2021 and during the first half of 2020. Meantime, in Africa and in Brazil, we've seen prices maintained at premiums over the entire period of between 15 cents and 40 cents a pound above prices from Vietnam. If we look at that, we should point out that there has been a big disparity in freight costs between shipments from Vietnam and shipments from West Africa, looking at target markets virtually anywhere, but certainly North America and Europe. But that the highest the freight disparity was about 25 cents a pound. So that there's more going on than just freight. We've also seen over this period higher farm gate prices right across the world. And we should mention that the biggest market in the world, India, is a market protected by import tariffs, where cashew prices trade at much higher levels, close to $4 a pound. And in a sense, we need to exclude India from this conversation, particularly as India has dropped away as an exporter. India has dropped away from 88,000 tons about 5 years ago to about 54,000 tons on average over the last 3 years. If we look at demand, again, we see relatively strong factors. US imports up 7% to the end of April, which is the latest figures that I have. Demand in India, quite steady. Vietnamese exports down 4% in 2022. But if we extract China from that, and it's a very identifiable series of factors that have influenced Chinese imports, Vietnamese exports would actually be up by 1% in the period January to May 2022. And if we look at that period and focus on the CAGR, the compound annual growth rate over 5 years of that January to May period, so we're talking about averaging out the growth in January, May versus the previous year, it's actually 7% per annum over the period. So Vietnamese exports have been growing very strongly over the past 5 years. If we look at processing, right now we see a situation where the value of raw cashew nuts in the international market doesn't allow a processing parity with kernels. What do we mean by that? We mean that if you were to buy raw cashew nuts today at the market price, bring them to Vietnam, process them, and re-export them, you would not be able to make a satisfactory profit margin. So they call that the parity. Maybe it's not the greatest explanation term, but that's what we call it. So the parity between the balance of RCN prices and kernels prices just isn't there and hasn't been there for months. Meantime, in Vietnam, we're seeing smaller processors closing down. You know, Vietnam has a highly stratified processing sector. You've got a lot of small, you've got large factories, packing stations, and many businesses in between. So what we're seeing is that the smaller factories have been closing down and ceasing to process, and some of the larger factories have been reducing their capacity. Now, that is not exactly borne out by the export figures, but that's what we're hearing from Vietnam. So that needs to be looked at a little bit more. Costs are spiraling. Now, when we talk about costs spiraling, we're talking here about particularly freight, particularly the cost of moving raw material from its origin to the area where it's processed. So in this, we're talking about 2 million tons of raw cashew nuts that move from Africa every year to India and to Vietnam for processing. And the costs of doing that have spiraled. All kinds of costs have spiraled. And this is an impact of the pandemic. It is not an impact of inflation. Inflation is the way we express how those costs have moved up. But it's energy and it's the pandemic are the two major factors in that. And there are a lot of other factors in there too. Meantime, African processing has been growing. As we know, the volume, I mentioned Cote d'Ivoire earlier, we know the volume will increase this year. We know there's a certain rationalization going on. And we also know that there are many plans in the pipeline for additional processing units in African countries. So that's the situation as it stands. Strong demand, low prices. These things seem to contradict each other. Costs above or very close to the value of the product being sold. How can we reconcile that? And why is it that prices, particularly from Vietnam, are so low? Let's have a look at some of the factors that may be involved. So first of all, we have seen a kind of a seasonal price trend emerge in recent years. We've seen a situation in each of the last 4 years. So this is a price chart for 320s for 2019, 2020, 21, and so far this year. And what we see is that early in the harvest season, we see a decline in price, and then we see a rise. Now, in 2020, that was a very sharp decline in price, probably down to the uncertainty around the pandemic. But it also happened last year, and it also happened this year, but not quite as you might expect. In the January-February period, it started a little bit earlier. The market price started to slide from September, October. So we've got to ask, why does that happen? Why does that pattern emerge? And we need to ask a few questions. So first of all, is this a response to a decline in demand? On the screen, you can see a chart that we've shown previously. I think we showed it 2 weeks ago. And these are the monthly exports for each month of the last 4 years. And you can see that there is generally a pretty strong upward trend, particularly in 2022, particularly in 2021, but in 2022, we are pretty much matching what happened last year. 4% down in Vietnam, mostly due to the situation in China. So we're not seeing prices lower because of a failure of demand. And we've already mentioned US demand and European demand. If we look at costs, we've seen a situation on costs where the area highlighted in red, the cost to move the product from where it grows to where it's processed, and this has moved up sharply over the past 2 to 3 years. But also the farm gate price has moved up. So we're seeing a number of factors here. We're seeing a stronger farm gate price, partially driven by minimum price regimes in the origins, partially driven by increasing freight and movement costs. where we get to a situation where the competitive advantage in processing, so lower cost of processing in Vietnam for African RCN, for example, I've used a figure of about $200 a ton, compared to average in Africa. Not everyone has a $450 per ton processing, some have lower, some still probably have higher, but not too many, where you get a situation where processing the product where it grows is competitive. If we look West African raw nuts processed in West Africa, if we look at Vietnamese or even Cambodian raw nuts processed in Vietnam, we see much lower cost of product than for the product that moves. India, again, is a different situation. It's a different situation because it's a different structure of market. Processing is more expensive. Raw nuts are higher priced. So what we're seeing is that the costs of import have increased at the same time that African factories have started to become competitive. So we also need to ask, is the lower price from Vietnam a response to more African processing? So what we see in general terms, taking into account more export taxes, minimum farm gate prices, higher costs for freight, we see that the competitiveness of processing far from origin has diminished. And so this is a chart. If you were with us in March, you might recognize this one. This is a chart we used then, and we analyzed the domestic raw nuts in Vietnam, imported raw nuts, and compared them to domestic raw nuts processed in Côte d'Ivoire. And we compared that to the average revenue in Vietnam and the average revenue in Côte d'Ivoire. The average revenues are different because the prices have been different. And this is to an FOB basis. It does not take into account differences in freight. This is a processor's perspective, not a buyer's perspective. And if we look at this, what we're seeing and what persists now is that processing, having moved the raw material 10,000 kilometers through two sets of taxes, so many trucks, I think we calculated the movement as something like 52 different moves. It's becoming very, very difficult to make a profit on raw nuts that are shipped all that distance, quite apart from any sustainability impact, quite apart from any contract risk, just simply on the costs, it's becoming more difficult. So when we look at those four factors, the seasonal price trend, the overall demand factors, the impact of costs, and the economics of processing, there's nothing in there that suggests that processors should drop, or even dramatically drop, cashew kernel prices at different periods over the past 3 years. So why would they do that? And we're focusing particularly on Vietnam. Why would the dominant supplier crash? And I use that figure because we're talking about prices in 2020 as low as $2.70, last year $2.80, this year $2.80, $2.85. Why would the dominant supplier crash kernels prices when demand is growing at record rates and prices were already, when that started, around $3.10 at 5-year lows? Why would that happen? And to put it in perspective, let's have a look at some of the factors in the market over that period. As I've said, kernels prices hit their lowest levels since February 2009, 3 times in the past 2 years. Vietnam remains the dominant supplier to the international cashew market, 89% of the US market in 2021, 77% of the European Union market, and total dominance in the Chinese market, probably 99%. If we look at Vietnam's kernels exports, well, it's a really healthy and a remarkable story. Kernels exports have grown by 64% since 2018. EU imports in the same period have grown by 44%. And US imports in the past 3 years have grown by 17%. These are remarkable figures. 44% market growth since 2018 is quite amazing. The US market, which for many years we were told was a mature market that would maybe grow slowly, maybe would contract, has absolutely surged upwards in the past 3 years. And it appears to be maintained long after the initial impact of the pandemic. There seems to be strong growth in demand. I mean, 17% in 3 years is pretty remarkable for a mature market. Meantime, farm gate prices have also increased. If we take the average farm gate prices over the course of the season, we see an increase over the past 3 years of about 21%. That doesn't take into account variations in quality, because that data is not available. But when we look at the general farm gate prices as reported by African Cashew Alliance reporters, we're looking at a 21% increase over the past 3 years. So from the fairly difficult seasons of 2018 and 2019, African farmers are recovering better value in recent years. We're not seeing anything in any of these facts that should indicate why cashew kernels prices would crash in the way they have done on those 3 events in the past 3 years. And finally, if we go back to costs, so we're seeing freight costs from Asia surging during the pandemic. We know that 20-foot containers at one stage hit prices close to $10,000 heading west or heading across the Pacific to the USA. We are now and have been seeing for some time that freight rates into Asia are increasing. So we're seeing it driven certainly by let's say the hangover of the pandemic, but also by capacity issues, energy costs. And I think as we all recognize, those 2 factors are not going to change anytime soon. So this is impacting on the costs of raw cashew nuts, as well as that differential in freight between exports from Asian countries going west and West African countries or East African countries also going west. So why would this situation come about? Why would we see this remarkable drop in prices in a period? Now, I don't have all the answers to this, but I have some suggestions and some questions. First of all, I think that there was essentially a misread of the impact of the pandemic, particularly its impact on Western countries. So the initial impact, which remarkably was repeated in 2021 early in the season, was that demand would crash. I think we all know by now that demand did exactly the opposite and surged during the pandemic. Even today, we still see the strength of demand. There are factors other than the pandemic at play, and they are much deeper and longer term factors influencing cashew kernel demand. Demand is healthy and likely to grow if we can meet it. Secondly, if we look at Vietnamese processors, I think what happened was that they eventually got to a position where their competitiveness was solely based on price. So if the market's difficult, drop the price. If the buyers aren't interested, drop the price. But in actual fact, as you drop prices, buyers tend to back away from the market. Buyers are more likely to quickly pull the trigger and make a decision when prices are rising. And I think there's a misunderstanding here of what makes a roaster or a buyer competitive, particularly in a market where private label packing is important. Buyers are interested in being competitive. Cashew demand was rising at $3.50 a pound. It was rising at $3.80 a pound, just at a slower rate. What really impacts demand is volatility. Creating volatility, creating uncertainty by crashing prices actually undermines the demand that you're looking for. So if you compete on price and price alone, And when you have that advantage, that's always bound to be the temptation. When you compete on price and price alone, your only reaction when the market goes a little bit quiet or becomes a little bit uncertain is to drop the price. And that may have had an influence on what we've been seeing. So what we're talking about there is a response to a perceived drop in demand that didn't happen. If we look at I think we should look at the influence of China in the early part of the year. So China is an important customer for cashews. It's an important customer in the early part of the year, particularly for Vietnam. So when we get a situation where February 2020, 21, and again this year, we see a disruption in the Chinese market, a fall in demand, or a fall at least in imports, if you're highly dependent on that market, you're going to react. And if you're a processor, perhaps not the largest processor or the most efficient processor or the most food safe processor, and you're dependent on that market and it closes, that strangles your cash flow. And you got to look for alternatives. And that would cause you possibly to panic and possibly to drop price. The next factor we look at is that these things are cumulative. You get 2-3 years of low profits or no profits, and you become more likely to drop the price, to behave perhaps a little bit erratically, certainly more impatiently, but it's not because you don't know what you're doing, it's because you're under the pressure of simply struggling to make money and to manage your cash flow. Then you've got to go to your bank with poor results and say, we want to borrow more money. How did you get on last year? Well, not too good. And so this thing becomes cumulative over a period. This long fractured supply chain that we have talked about already, and we've talked about many times at ACA events, the movement of raw cashews over these 10, 14,000 kilometer range, depending on where you're coming from or where you're going, has become very difficult to manage. It's become very difficult to manage as costs rise. So this fractured supply chain, as I call it, has started to erode the competitiveness of Vietnamese cashew processors. And if we look at the supply chain, it's not a supply chain in which the processor, either in India or in Vietnam, is heavily involved. Even in some African countries, if we look today at how engaged processors are in their supply chain, we'll find that actually they're not. They don't know the farmers, they buy from the local trader. It's the local trader that does the job with the farmers. So the long nature and the difficult nature of the supply chain, the high number of actors, the lack of integration in the supply chain, particularly in times of rising costs and other uncertainties, and you couldn't have a more uncertain period than the last 2.5 years, causes surprising, unpredictable reaction. And I think that's one of the reasons why prices crashed or were crashed in the period. I think we also have to point out to the fact that the market analysis and the market information is poor in the sector generally. As you know, ACA is trying to do something about that for African stakeholders. Certainly, I think there's been a misread or a poor analysis, a lack of understanding of customers' needs and a lack of understanding of the reaction of customers. When just point to the pandemic, no one will buy cashews anymore. Actually, wrong. They'll buy more. No one will come to the market. Buyers will stop buying. They'll stop importing. Absolutely the opposite. And indeed, if we think about the motivation for the growth in the consumption of edible nuts generally, but particularly cashews in the last 10 years, looking at healthy eating, consumption of more vegetable protein, nuts fit into this. And it seems obvious that in times of health concerns, that people would buy more of this product, not to mention the fact that many of them were working from home. So a poor understanding of the customer and a poor understanding of the market information. And one very basic thing, if you rely on your customers for information, particularly if your customer is an intermediary trading at a really tight trading margin, you run the risk that you will not be properly informed. You run the risk that your customer is seeing much higher demand, but why would he tell you that? And there's big lessons for the African cashew sector in all of these factors, particularly in this one. By the way, I'm trying to give some weight to the factors. So you can see the red means I think it's a really strong influence on this situation. Orange, a little bit less so, and the lighter color less so again. And so the final factor, and this factor is often mentioned in African countries as the primary motivator, but I don't believe that it is the primary motivator. I think that there is an effort to influence RCN prices, for sure. That's always been there. But I don't think businesses would sacrifice their own profitability to get the price of raw material lower. And I don't think they would do that at the times of year when they're buying their own domestic crop. In any case, it hasn't worked. This year is pretty good evidence of that, where we haven't seen what might be interpreted as efforts to drop RCN prices or to at least influence them. We haven't seen it work. Now, there may be in this whole situation amongst RCN traders, amongst processors in Asia, indeed, perhaps amongst processors in African countries too, there may be a kind of an underestimation of the ability of suppliers to know what's going on, of the information available to suppliers, and an underestimation of the factors. So perhaps thinking that, well, look, okay, RCN is out of line with kernels prices. If we knock down the kernels prices, these guys will come into line. But as we've seen, they don't. And really, they don't, not necessarily because they just don't want to, or they want to make more money, or they're greedy. They don't come into line because they can't, because the costs, the price at the farm gate, the costs of evacuation, the costs of the freight just don't allow them to do so. It's not a speculative play, if you like. It's much more related to costs. So we see these factors, these 7 factors, and we see push and pull on kernels prices. And I hope it becomes a little bit clearer why we might get this apparently illogical crashing of kernels prices. And we should add that these are linked. So they kind of feed each other. So if your competitiveness is based on price, you're much more vulnerable to a restriction in your cash flow. You're much more vulnerable to an effort to, or much more tempted even, to try and influence RCN prices. If you have a long supply chain, you're much more vulnerable to poor market information or poor market understanding. And you're much more likely to try and influence RCN prices when in fact, really what you should be doing is looking at the kernels prices and seeing how you can improve those. So we have a number of factors that might explain. I'm sure there are others. I'm sure some people with us today can come up with others. But these are some of the factors that I think start to explain this apparently illogical crashing of price in the first half of 2020, 2021, and 2022. And we need to consider what is the likely impact of this kind of price volatility. And frankly, I don't think it's good news. I think we can see a negative impact. And we look at these impacts again under the 3 headings of prices, demand, and processing. So if we look at prices to begin with, now we're talking again to remind you about the price crashes, the lack of parity between RCN and kernels, and the volatility that we've seen in cashew kernels prices over the past 3 years. And we talk about the impact. So what we're seeing is we're seeing this mismatch between raw cashew nut prices and kernels prices persisting. It's likely that that will be corrected. It's probable that that will be corrected at some point, and that may be corrected in a very volatile fashion. We could see prices move up, which would lead to contract default on kernels or on RCN. We have seen some renegotiation of RCN contracts already, so that we could see a situation where, again, price volatility kicks in, damaging demand, but also damaging prices at the farm gate, which have been quite healthy. And that impact could damage the most vulnerable people in the entire supply chain, no matter where they live, the farmers and their families. And that's a factor that needs to be considered. Secondly, if we look at the impact on demand, certainly lower prices have been positive for demand. But the growth in demand is based on unrealistic pricing. We know it's unrealistic because processors are not profitable in Asian countries at these prices, particularly Vietnam. So demand growth based on unrealistic pricing could lead to a difficult situation. It does create an opportunity to integrate. In other words, to take lower prices, take business at a supermarket level, maybe from the existing holder of the business, by cutting the price. But that creates a vicious circle. So you go to the supermarket with a lower price, they take the business, they expect a lower price the following year. But the first price was never really workable anyway. And we've seen that in Europe already this year, where business has been done at relatively unrealistic prices. This will cause strains in relationships between roasters and supermarkets. Roasters will wonder, well, how little a price change does my customer move on for? After all those years of working together, you move for a few cents, and that strains the relationships. Supermarkets may feel they can address that by sourcing directly, but that it doesn't actually make sense, given that the basic price on which their demand is based is too low in any case. And until that's corrected, you can't get a rebalancing of that situation and those relationships, again, adding to volatility. At processing level, I think we're already beginning to see the impact of this. We're seeing reduced processing in Vietnam. I feel that's likely to continue. We are seeing increased processing in Africa, but there is definitely not enough time for African processing to make up the gap. So it brings us to the question, if demand continues to rise based on these low prices, but also based on a number of other positive factors, will there be enough processing capacity to meet that? And the answer today is probably no, which would itself force kernels prices and increase volatility. I think in time, there will be more processing in African countries, and we will get a better balance. And you can see the day when the cashews that grow in Africa are predominantly processed in Africa. The cashews that grow in Asia are predominantly processed, as they are now in Vietnam. But there's a big, big challenge to try and meet something we haven't seen for 30 years, which is declining processing volumes around the world. And that challenge is firmly with African processors right now. So we could see a situation where there are not enough kernels being produced on a monthly basis, which will restrict pricing and could slow the growth in demand. It could also have impacts on production and growing. So low prices are not necessarily good news. Certainly a chain where one sector is under extreme pressure, and that's processing today. If we go back 20 years, it was growers. If we go back to 2005 to 2008, prices at the farm gate were incredibly low. Growers didn't make a fair living from their cashews. At the moment, it's come full circle and its processes in that situation. These are some of the impacts that I see. I'll be really interested to hear your comments on how you see it. So looking at the general market and looking at the current situation and the outlook, the way I'm seeing it is we're going to see a pickup in the demand for raw cashew nuts in the coming weeks. We're going to see the kernels market relatively steady. I don't think that the ingredients are there for a major rise in price just yet. Definitely higher costs. Higher energy costs means higher freight rates. There's no two ways about it. Tightening inventory as buyers delay decisions, use their inventory. I think we will see in this year and again in the longer term a rationalization continuing in Vietnam. And that can happen in a number of ways. It can happen less processing capacity, bigger factories. It could happen in the more integration in the supply chain. It could be also more value addition at the origin. So products would be roasted and perhaps consumer packed for export. But I think the big theme for the rest of this year and long into the future is greater integration of supply chains in response to volatile circumstances, uncertainty, and drawing on the lessons of the pandemic and what is perhaps we could even call it an energy crisis, certainly a fuel cost crisis at the moment. So thanks very much indeed. I'm going to pass you back to Blessing, who will introduce our guests and ask them to comment on their markets. Blessing, over to you.
Yes, Jim, thank you very much for the presentation. Joining us this morning are two stakeholders in the cashew industry. We have Madame Minata Kone, who is the CEO of Sotriabi, a processing factory in Burkina Faso. Together, we also have Abiona Heman, who is the current president of Interprofession for Benin, and also an exporter himself. I think we'll begin with Madame Kone, who we have been trying to have her join us in the last two sessions. Thankfully, she recorded her input, so we'll play it for the audience and then take questions for her. She's also online to answer those questions. So I'll just have my colleague play Madame Kone inputs. Thank you.
Bonjour à tous. Bonjour Jim. Et je m'en vais vous présenter la filière anacarde au Burkina Faso campagne 2022. La filière anacarde au Burkina Faso est organisée autour d'une interprofession et composée de 3 maillons. Le maillon des producteurs, et celui des transformateurs et celui des commerçants et exportateurs d'anacarde. Et selon l'Union nationale des producteurs d'anacarde, les prévisions de collecte pour la campagne 2022 étaient de 180 000 tonnes. Et malheureusement, avec les effets du changement climatique, ces prévisions n'ont pas été au rendez-vous. Les chiffres aujourd'hui tournent autour de 100 000 tonnes. Et il faut noter cependant que la qualité de la noix brune du Burkina s'est améliorée ces dernières années et avec l'appui des différents partenaires qui accompagnent les acteurs dans notre pays. Et au niveau de la production, au niveau de la récolte et la post-récolte. Alors, c'est le lieu de remercier tous ces partenaires-là. Et le KOR aujourd'hui est supérieur à 45. Et cette année, au lancement de la campagne, le prix plancher était fixé à 330 francs auprès du producteur. Alors, très vite, les prix se sont envolés. sur le marché national et jusqu'à atteindre 540 francs le kilo. Et certains ont même pu vendre à plus de 540. Et ceci n'a pas été sans conséquence sur les autres maillons. Au niveau de la transformation, par exemple, certaines unités n'ont pas pu s'approvisionner à cause de ces prix-là. Sur une vingtaine d'unités sur le terrain, et seulement 5 sont en activité. Il était prévu aussi à ce niveau la transformation de 37 000 tonnes et de noix brutes avec 25 000 tonnes de noix biologiques, certifiées biologiques. Mais aujourd'hui, les 5 unités qui travaillent traitent uniquement des noix certifiées biologiques. C'est pour dire que tout le reste est dans l'attente jusqu'à quand on ne sait. Alors, ceci est la conséquence, il faut le dire, des prix élevés sur le marché local, mais aussi des faibles prix sur le marché international des amandes. Aujourd'hui, il est difficile pour un transformateur burkinabé qui transforme uniquement la noix conventionnelle de travailler et de vendre sur le marché international des amandes analysées à tête froide. Aujourd'hui, au niveau de l'exportation, 2 couloirs sont
Hello, Jim. I would have to interrupt Madam Kone's input because I don't know if you are also, but we are mostly having difficulties to hear her. So I would have to interrupt her input and Jim, I was saying we would have to interrupt Madam Kone's inputs because I could barely hear what she was saying. I don't know if you heard her clearly. If not, we can call on Herman to continue and then go back to Madam Kone afterwards. Is that okay?
Yes, certainly. Let's do that.
Okay. Herman, can you hear me? Hello, Herman?
Yes, je vous entends.
Yes, please. Thank you for joining us this morning, and we would like to continue with you. Like I explained, we have some difficulties hearing Madam Kone. So please, you are welcome, and thank you for joining us. Please go ahead.
Merci beaucoup. Merci infiniment à Aka pour m'avoir invité pour participer à cette séance d'information sur le marché. Le Bénin est dans une nouvelle dynamique sur le plan national par rapport à la filière anacarde. Et annuellement, je vous présente quelques statistiques que nous avons eues en 2021 liées à la production et à l'exportation. Alors, en 2021, nous avons eu une prévision de production d'environ 250 000 tonnes. Et à l'arrivée, nous sommes autour des 250 000 tonnes qui sont structurées comme suit. Nous avons selon les statistiques du bord de notre voie officielle de sortie des noix de cajou, nous avons 1880 tonnes d'amandes de cajou qui ont été exportées vers les destinations principales comme le Pays-Bas, le Vietnam, les États-Unis, le Liban et l'Italie. Alors, si nous tenons compte de ces 1880 tonnes d'amandes qui ont été exportées, ça équivaut environ à 6500 tonnes de noix de cajou qui ont été transformées sur le plan national et ça fait toujours moins de 10% de la production nationale. En termes de noix de cajou brutes exportées, nous avons relevé au niveau de nos services douaniers, du port de Cotonou et phytosanitaires, une statistique de 233 000 tonnes 72 qui ont été exportées via le port de Cotonou. Alors, lorsque nous ajoutons les 6500 tonnes de noix de cajou transformées, nous sommes au plus de 239 572 tonnes de noix de cajou qui ont été exportées, qui ont été manipulées. Et nous n'occultons pas les noix de cajou qui sont sorties par voie terrestre vers le Togo, vers le Nigeria, exportées par voie terrestre, qui, selon les informations qui nous sont venues à travers le point focal, tournaient autour de 12 000 tonnes. Donc, en gros, nous sommes autour d'une production annuelle de 251 000 tonnes, 252 000 tonnes de noix de cajou brut. Alors, donc, ces prévisions de 250 000 tonnes ont été largement, disons, un tout petit peu dépassées. Et cette année, nous avons également fait la même prévision sur la base de ces statistiques au niveau de l'interprofession. Et disons qu'il y a certains facteurs qui ne nous ont pas permis forcément d'être rassurés dans l'atteinte de ces objectifs. Par exemple, le facteur climatique et disons, les facteurs d'aménagement. Parce que depuis 2-3 ans, le gouvernement béninois a entamé un vaste programme d'aménagement des plantations au niveau du Bénin. Et nous nous sommes dit que ces aménagements qui ont commencé ont eu un impact non négligeable sur la production 2022 que nous sommes en train d'avoir. Alors, disons que jusqu'à présent, pour les données que nous avons collectées au niveau du Bénin, à travers les ponts bascules, parce qu'il faut attendre la fin de la campagne pour avoir les données officielles au niveau du port de Cotonou. Alors, à travers les ponts bascules, nous sommes à un enregistrement avoisinant les 165 000 tonnes et nous avons un stock résiduel encore sur le terrain qui n'est pas assez consistant, qui tournerait autour de 10 000, 15 000 tonnes. Donc, en termes de statistiques au niveau du Bénin, nous sommes en train d'évoluer en termes de production et ça va aller de façon continue à croître parce que ces aménagements qui ont été effectués, qui ont commencé depuis 3 ans déjà, vont s'ajouter le vaste programme de mise en terre des 2 millions de plants greffés à fort que le gouvernement a déjà commencé à mettre en œuvre. Et nous espérons que d'ici les 3-4 prochaines années, ces 2 millions de plants arrivent à produire suffisamment pour que nous atteignions l'objectif d'aller vers les 500 000 tonnes à l'horizon 2030. Alors, au niveau du prix, au départ, le gouvernement a fixé son prix plancher à 350, mais à l'arrivée, nous avons un prix moyen de 515, le prix Borchamp, qui trouve autour de 515. Et la pression que les frontières brutes au niveau du Bénin a enflammé le marché local et nous sommes très vite passés à des prix exorbitants allant jusqu'à 600 au niveau Borchamp et des prix autonomes sur le marché secondaire qui tournaient autour de 750 dans la période du mois d'avril. Alors, donc, disons que le prix moyen boxant tourne autour de 515 et nous pensons que voilà, les prix boxant fixés par le gouvernement ne sont pas forcément en adéquation avec les offres et ils sont sur le terrain. Alors, l'autre chose qu'il faut noter, comme l'a notifié Jim dans sa présentation, nous sommes dans une phase de constatation d'une baisse continue de la qualité des noix de cajou. Alors, ce qu'il faut préciser pour le cas du Bénin, c'est que la baisse de la qualité des noix de cajou n'est pas corrélée avec le matériel végétal. Les raisons qui expliquent cette baisse de qualité sont au niveau village, parce que lorsque les producteurs, premièrement, les producteurs ne cueillent pas les noix à maturité, n'attendent pas que les noix viennent à maturité, pour les raisons de vol dans les plantations. Et l'autre chose, il y a la question de conditionnement de stockage. Alors, aujourd'hui, compte tenu de l'inaccessibilité ou la difficulté d'avoir accès aux sacs de jute, les producteurs sont obligés de stocker ces noix de cajou dans des sacs de maïs, des sacs de blé qui ne sont pas adaptés au stockage de noix de cajou, ce qui crée des pourritures au niveau des stocks et une forte humidité. Donc, au niveau des intrants de stockage, je pense qu'il y a un travail qui est en train de faire actuellement au niveau de l'interprofession pour voir avec le gouvernement et certaines parties prenantes afin de trouver un moyen pour que les intrants de stockage soient accessibles directement aux producteurs et à un coût assez compétitif par rapport à ce que nous constatons d'habitude sur le marché local. Alors, et en termes de réglementation, il faut dire que il y a un certain constat qui a été effectué par le gouvernement béninois lié à la sortie exagérée de matières premières agricoles, y compris le cajou, le soja et d'autres spéculations. Et donc, disons, au cours de l'année, du premier trimestre de 2022, l'État a pris des dispositions pour, disons, forcer un peu la sortie des noix de cajou par voie terrestre. Alors, il est fixé un montant de 50 francs CFA au kilo à payer au cordon douanier lorsque vous voulez faire l'exportation par voie maritime. Mais si vous voulez le faire par voie terrestre, vous ajoutez 20 francs de plus. Donc, ça fait environ 70 francs par kilo que vous ajoutez pour l'exportation par voie terrestre. C'est une mesure qui a été prise par le gouvernement béninois afin de contenir les noix de cajou sur le territoire national et pour apporter un coup de pouce aux transformateurs locaux. Alors, il faut également dire que l'interprofession a, depuis quelques années, dans son processus d'identification des acteurs qui opèrent sur le terrain, a mis en place une stratégie d'enrichissement des opérateurs, que ce soit au niveau de l'exportation, de la transformation, et nous délivrons une attestation de participation aux acteurs qui participent chaque année aux activités de commercialisation de cajou en République du Bénin. Et ça nous permet d'avoir un registre assez officiel de tous les acteurs qui interagissent dans la commercialisation de noix de cajou. Qui nous permettront d'améliorer notre système de commercialisation. Alors, au-delà de ça, nous avons l'initiation du contrôle de la qualité à l'export. C'est une activité qui ne se faisait pas, mais qui a été initiée cette année à travers l'Agence béninoise de sécurité sanitaire des aliments, qui a initié le certificat de qualité à l'export pour le noix de cajou, comme lorsque vous exportez les noix de cajou brut que vous envoyez en Inde, il y a les structures officielles reconnues par l'État comme la contrôle RBS qui certifient les conteneurs à destination. Alors ici, l'État a pris l'option de certifier les conteneurs au départ afin de relever des données de qualité des noix de cajou qui sont en partance du Bénin vers les destinations. Alors, il y a une base de données qui a été créée pour ça. Les enregistrements des conteneurs ont été effectués comme tu l'as su voir. Et il y a une attestation de qualité qui est délivrée à chaque contrôle des conteneurs par l'autorité compétente. Ça, c'est une des mesures officielles d'innovation qui ont été mises en place cette année au niveau de notre interprofession au niveau du Bénin. Et pour finir, en termes de réglementation, il y a la fameuse décision liée à la suppression de l'exportation des noix de cajou brut à partir du 1er avril 2024. Alors, il faut, parce qu'il y a, disons, beaucoup de participants qui sont réellement inquiets par rapport à cette décision que le gouvernement béninois a prise, liée à la suppression de l'exportation de noix de cajou au Bénin à partir de 2024. Il faut dire que, disons, au niveau des transformateurs locaux, il y a cette traditionnelle problématique liée à l'approvisionnement en matières premières compte tenu de la pression des exportateurs sur la noix de cajou. Par exemple, cette année, en 2022, nous avons enregistré au niveau de l'interprofession via le Conseil des exportateurs 127 sociétés exportatrices de noix de cajou qui ont exprimé l'intention d'exporter les noix de cajou béninoises. Alors, 127 sociétés de noix de cajou, exportatrices de noix de cajou, pour une production d'environ 250 000 tonnes, ça laisse en réalité des difficultés aux consommateurs d'aller sur ce marché assez concurrentiel pour s'approvisionner afin de trouver de la matière première pour faire tout bénéficier. Ça, c'était la première condition. Alors, donc, il fallait trouver un moyen pour aider à apporter un coup de main aux consommateurs. Et il faut dire qu'il y a de nouveaux investisseurs qui sont au Bénin, qui sont en train d'investir énormément avec des intentions de transformation allant de 30 000 tonnes à 100 000 tonnes. Les unités de transformation sont en cours d'installation actuellement. Et il faut, d'une manière ou d'une autre, trouver un moyen pour que ces investissements qui sont en train d'être effectués ne puissent pas être compromis par défaut d'obtention de la matière première. Donc, c'est ça, en réalité, toutes ces analyses qui ont amené le gouvernement béninois à adopter cette disposition qui sera effective à partir du mois d'avril 2024 en niveau du Bénin. Alors, donc, c'est, disons, l'interprofession et les acteurs, nous sommes en train de faire des analyses opérationnelles pour voir l'influence ou les retombées positives ou négatives de la prise de cette décision sur les acteurs traditionnels, les nouveaux acteurs, afin de voir quelles sont les mesures d'adaptation que nous allons mettre en place pour également non seulement apporter notre soutien aux exportateurs qui peuvent, disons, se transformer en consommateurs, et également comment protéger les producteurs dans le cadre dans ce contexte pour qu'ils puissent continuer à avoir les meilleures offres en termes de mise en marché de leur production. Et au niveau de la transformation, et je pense que j'ai bien commencé par en parler, le Bénin dispose à la date d'aujourd'hui de 14 usines de transformation. Cette année, ça a été un relevé passé très fort, à 600, ce qui était impossible à acquérir pour les usines. Donc, il fallait attendre la première partie du mois de mai pour connaître une baisse de prix sur le terrain et permettre aux consommateurs d'acheter afin de tourner leur usine comme cela se doit pour le peu de temps qui reste pour la fin de la campagne. Alors, jusqu'à présent, nous n'avons pas encore collecté l'ensemble des données sur les stocks achetés au niveau des usines, mais nous pouvons dire que sur les 14 usines de consommation, il y a 6 qui sont opérationnelles de façon continue. Ils ont acheté, consommé, ils sont dans le processus de consommation. Et donc, il faille d'une manière ou d'une autre voir d'ici le mois de juillet, pour voir réellement quel a été le niveau de consommation que ces usines ont atteint sur la base de leur capacité réelle. Donc, disons, c'est les quelques informations que j'aimerais partager avec les participants et dire, pour finir, que voilà, le Bénin est ouvert à toute proposition d'installation de nouvelles usines parce qu'il y a une zone économique spéciale qui a été créée pour faciliter la transformation des matières premières. Et aussi, nos usines locales qui sont là ont besoin de partenariats durables en joint venture, par exemple, pour essayer d'atteindre le niveau de capacité de leur plateforme industrielle. Et donc, si vous êtes intéressé ou s'il y a des participants qui pensent que, bon, nous pouvons interagir avec le Bénin sur la transformation locale, je pense que Jim l'a dit, il est un peu difficile que la transformation de la noix de cajou soit assez profitable lorsque cette noix est loin du pays de provenance. Et donc, vous êtes bienvenus au Bénin pour entrer en contact avec nos usines déjà installées pour voir déjà quelles sont les possibilités de partenariat. L'interprofession est là pour nous faciliter toutes les dispositions pour que vous puissiez avoir la facilité d'interagir avec ces usines. Et je vous remercie. Merci beaucoup, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Herman. Very interesting. It's very interesting to hear that production is rising so quickly in Benin. And it will be interesting to see the impact of these innovative policies on the pricing at the farm gate and on the development of processing. Thank you very much indeed. Blessing, are we going to show Madam Kone's contribution again?
Yes. We are going to replay Madam Kone's input, but I'd like to clarify a little oversight on the part of interpretation. Production in 2022 from Burkina, the forecast is at 180,000 metric ton, but there was an error and the interpretation came up as actual production being 5,000 metric tons. So I want to just correct that before we go ahead to play Madam Kone's input. I think it's already showing on the screen. Can you see it?
Yes, I see it.
Bonjour à tous. Bonjour Jim. Et j'aimerais vous présenter la filière amicale au Burkina Faso campagne 2022. La filière amicale au Burkina Faso est organisée autour d'une interprofession et composée de 3 maillons. Le maillon des producteurs, et celui des transformateurs et celui des commerçants et exportateurs d'anacarde. Et selon l'Union nationale des producteurs d'anacarde, les prévisions de collecte pour la campagne 2022 était de 180 000 tonnes. Et malheureusement, avec les effets du changement climatique, ces prévisions n'ont pas été au rendez-vous. Les chiffres aujourd'hui tournent autour de 100 000 tonnes. Et il faut noter cependant que la qualité de la noix brune du Burkina s'est améliorée ces dernières années, et avec l'appui des différents partenaires qui accompagnent les acteurs dans notre pays. Et au niveau de la production, au niveau de la récolte et la post-récolte. Alors, c'est le lieu de remercier tous ces partenaires-là. Et le KOR aujourd'hui est supérieur à 45. Et cette année, au lancement de la campagne, le prix plancher était fixé à 330 francs auprès du producteur. Alors, très vite, les prix se sont envolés sur le marché national et jusqu'à atteindre 540 francs le kilo. Et certains ont même pu vendre à plus de 540. Et ceci n'a pas été sans conséquence sur les autres maillons. Au niveau de la transformation, par exemple, certaines unités n'ont pas pu s'approvisionner à cause de ces prix-là. Sur une vingtaine d'unités sur le terrain, et seulement 5 sont en activité. Il était prévu aussi à ce niveau la transformation de 37 000 tonnes et de noix brutes avec 25 000 tonnes de noix biologiques, certifiées biologiques. Mais aujourd'hui, les 5 unités qui travaillent traitent uniquement des noix certifiées biologiques. C'est pour dire que tout le reste est dans l'attente, jusqu'à quand on le sait. Alors, ceci est la conséquence, il faut le dire, des prix élevés sur le marché local, mais aussi des faibles prix sur le marché international des amandes. Aujourd'hui, il est difficile pour un transformateur burkinabé qui transforme uniquement la noix conventionnelle de travailler et de vendre sur le marché international des amandes au même prix que les autres concurrents et d'autres continents. Et donc, c'est une situation assez difficile qui mérite d'être analysée à tête froide. Aujourd'hui, au niveau de l'exportation, 2 couloirs sont utilisés, le couloir togolais et le couloir béninois. Les 2 corridors, c'est par ces 2 corridors que les exportations se passent. Je crois qu'au niveau du Ghana, ça n'a pas été comme les autres années. Au Burkina Faso, il existe ce qu'on appelle un prélèvement sur l'exportation et la réexportation de la noix brute. Alors, les fonds issus de ce prélèvement sont gérés par une structure créée par le ministère en charge du commerce qui se nomme Conseil burkinabé de l'ANACAD. Et depuis 2018, les fonds sont prélevés. Et bon, mais la stabilisation des prix sur le marché reste en tout cas très difficile parce que les pics et les bas au niveau des prix de la matière première relèvent d'une des missions de cette structure, à savoir la régulation. Et en tout cas, jusque-là, le marché n'est pas régulé. Les fonds sont là, une subvention est octroyée à l'interprofession et avec tous les maillons. Mais nous estimons que ces appuis-là doivent être revus afin de permettre à cette filière de travailler et de mériter la place qu'elle occupe au niveau national. Et une autre question qui mérite d'être analysée au niveau de tous les acteurs de la chaîne de valeur du cajou en Afrique, c'est la position de l'Afrique sur le marché international des amandes. Aujourd'hui, avec beaucoup de recul, nous constatons les nombreuses difficultés que les acteurs, que les transformateurs et ceux qui exportent les amandes rencontrent sur le marché. Il s'agit premièrement des prix. Et les Vietnamiens, nos amis, proposent des prix assez faibles. Cela se comprend parce qu'ils ont la technologie, ils sont leaders en matière de technologie et ces prix faibles ne peuvent pas être suivis par les transformateurs africains parce que les charges sont plus élevées ici et nous importons pratiquement tous les équipements de ce pays-là. Et les équipements, en tout cas, d'une certaine technicité, viennent du Vietnam, essentiellement. Au niveau de ces équipements, au départ, quand on les achetait, il n'y avait pas de notice d'emploi. Les équipements venaient, les techniciens venaient les monter, et puis c'était tout. Si vous avez des problèmes, si vous pouvez faire venir un technicien, vous le faites venir. Le second point, ce sont les pièces de rechange. Le problème des pièces de rechange est essentiel et c'est très important pour nous. Parce que au Vietnam, ce que nous avons constaté, c'est que quand ils fabriquent une machine, ils mettent une machine sur le marché et un an et demi, le modèle change. Et quand le modèle change, on a un problème de pièces de rechange parce que nous, ici en Afrique, on n'en fabrique pas. On n'en fabrique pas. Et il faut qu'on se réveille. Sinon, toutes les unités qu'on voit, toutes les grandes usines qu'on voit, vont dans un avenir proche avoir des problèmes de pièces de rechange. Parce que les modèles évoluent très rapidement. Ils ont raison. Ils veulent rester leaders sur le marché. Et donc, ils réfléchissent. Ils inventent tout ce qui peut faire faciliter, tout ce qui peut donner une vraie rentabilité à leur business. Bon, donc, nous qui prenons les pièces de rechange chez eux, c'est à nous de nous organiser ici et de voir comment répondre à cette question de pièces de rechange. Aujourd'hui encore, quand on importe les machines, il y a des notices maintenant, mais la notice est essentiellement dans leur langue locale. Ici, il est difficile de trouver quelqu'un pour faire les traductions afin que les entreprises puissent exploiter de manière correcte ces notices-là et entretenir les machines. Alors, donc vous voyez, nous avons en tout cas beaucoup de batailles, beaucoup de défis à lever ici en Afrique, et il va falloir qu'on associe nos intelligences et qu'on voit qu'est-ce qu'il y a lieu de faire avec l'accompagnement de ACA. Nous pensons que le Vietnam n'a pas à faire de la compétition avec les Africains. Non. Le Vietnam doit avoir des rapports de collaboration avec les Africains. Comme disent les gens, nous sommes ensemble et nous pouvons évoluer ensemble. Parce que la matière première, c'est aussi en Afrique et la technologie en Asie. Les Africains doivent réfléchir à comment s'organiser, et en tout cas pour répondre à cette question essentielle. Maintenant, il faut féliciter la Côte d'Ivoire parce que c'est un pays qui, voulant prendre le leadership au niveau de la production, a réfléchi à comment faire la transformation, que la transformation suive aussi chez eux. Et pour cela, les premières machines ont été mises sur le marché et à travers CETA, vraiment nous avons découvert de bonnes choses. Et je crois que c'est le lieu vraiment de les féliciter. Et de voir ensemble dans notre sous-région comment nous pouvons en tout cas exploiter ce potentiel afin que, on ne soit pas totalement dépendant d'ailleurs. Et je demande à ce que les Africains travaillent sur les marchés de niche, tels que les produits certifiés biologiques, et qu'ils exploitent les marchés équitables qui sont là, et que vraiment on ne se retrouve pas un jour avec notre matière première sur les mains, parce que notre position sur le marché international des amendes a été réduite et limitée. Et je pense que ces échanges avec M. Jim nous donnent beaucoup d'informations et que nous devons exploiter et que nous pouvons en tout cas prendre tout ce qui peut nous permettre de renforcer notre position sur le marché international. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much, Madam Kone. We have to cut you short because we are running out of time and we have pending questions. Jim, I have some questions here for you. Are you with me?
Yes, I am, Blessing.
Hello, Jim. I have some questions here, and I'm going to try and see if we can take all the questions before we hit our 11 o'clock time. So the first question here is, somebody wants to know, considering that processing volumes in Vietnam is dropping, do you see India coming back as exporter of kernels? Is there a possibility of India coming back?
It's certainly a possibility. The economics of it might be challenging. I mean, why would an Indian processor export when they can sell in their domestic market at a higher price? There may be other reasons for that. We should keep an eye on the currency. I think India has lost ground in some markets, Japan, for example, during the pandemic. I see no reason why India might not make a comeback. in the export market.
Okay. When you compare with African processors, do you see African processors being able to compete with Vietnam in terms of prices? And how can this be possible?
Well, I think we have to look at a couple of areas. First of all, we have to look at costs. And the big question for African processors is, can they get to a level of processing cost that allows them to be competitive? And the answer from some is coming that yes, they can. So if we consider that to bring raw material to Vietnam is very expensive nowadays and getting more and more costly, then the gap between the Vietnamese processing cost and the African processing cost is effectively closed by those increases. So if African processors can get their costings down to levels around about $300 a ton for processing cost, they can very much compete. Plus, then we look at competitive advantages for certain markets: lower cost freight, traceable product, quality product, fast delivery time. These are all factors that would be very attractive for markets, particularly in Europe, but also in the United States. So I think they can.
Jim, I have another question here. We've been advocating for processing at origin and saying processing far from origin, it's not profitable. But when you look at Cambodian RC, and they seem to make it profitable for Vietnam. So how long will this advantage continue, and how much growth, of the Vietnamese processing industry can be sustained by the products from Cambodia?
Well, I think if we look at Cambodia and you look at the distances and the cost from Cambodian production areas to the main Vietnamese processing areas, they're essentially in the same region. There's no taxation between the two. And therefore, I would consider Cambodia as being in a catchment area for Vietnamese processors. It's therefore the processing far from origin doesn't actually apply in that case. However, there are other aspects such as traceability and quality and certification, which mean that processing in Cambodia could be profitable. Vietnamese processing can continue to rely on Cambodian raw cashew nuts, and Cambodian production of raw cashew nuts will increase. And therefore, as I was saying during the talk earlier, it's quite possible that you get a regionalization so that Vietnam relies on perhaps Cambodian and Vietnamese raw cashew nuts, and African raw cashew nuts are for the most part processed in West Africa. But certainly the fact that the high level of cost is mitigating against further expansion of Vietnam's cashew processing sector. And I personally feel that in 2022, we probably saw the high point, at least in terms of volume, of Vietnamese cashew processing, and it will rationalize and settle down from there.
Thank you, Jim. We still have a few questions here. Someone wants to know, regarding the 7 factors why a dominant supplier would crash kernel prices. You talked about competitiveness based on price. And the person wants to know, wouldn't this be synonymous to kernel price manipulation by the dominant supplier?
I'll just show those factors again. I mean, okay, you could consider that there might be a level of price manipulation in order to impact the price of the available raw cashew nuts. But I don't really believe that an industry over a sustained period is going to damage itself by keeping prices lower with the idea that it might either reduce the cost of raw material or cause the development of a competing origin to be slowed down. I just don't really see that as, you don't destroy or damage your own industry in order to stop someone else doing it. And therefore, being competitive on price to a level that can sustain profits in your own sector makes perfect sense. But dropping prices into the level of, loss making doesn't really make any sense. So whilst I wouldn't absolutely rule out an element of manipulation, I don't really think that manipulation is the motivating factor behind lower prices. I think these factors that we've mentioned, plus some others, are there, not ruling out manipulation at times, but not as a primary motivator.
Thank you, Jim. I have another question here. The attendee wants to know, when you look at kernel puzzles, the person wants to know a factor each for price, demand, and processing that would impact kernel price.
Could you repeat that question, Blessing, please?
Yeah, looking at kernel puzzle, can you give one factor each for price, demand, and processing that impacts on the kernel price? So looking at the overall impact on kernel price from a price perspective, from a demand perspective, and from a processing perspective.
Well, I think factors that influence price are availability, demand, clearly, these are the obvious things, but also then we look at other factors, more technical factors. Quality is a factor, certification is a factor, location is a factor, location in terms of cost to bring the product to where it's needed, to the market it's needed, but also time. And then we have other factors like traceability. We have factors such as marketing, branding, product presentation. There are a whole range of factors that contribute to the value of a product. I mean, you can say crudely that the value of a product is simply what someone will pay for it. But what motivates that level of value is all of the factors that we've mentioned. And there is one other factor that I'd add, and that is the perception of risk. If a buyer sees a product or an origin or a factory as risky, in other words, that they might not ship the container, it might be poor quality when it's shipped, then they will reduce the price in order to manage that risk. And therefore, you can see in cashew kernels prices, if you see a list of FOB prices from most brokers around the world, you'll see a kind of a ranking system, which is reflected in the prices that are asked for the kernels.
Thank you, Jim. With just 9 minutes to go, I have one last question. Perhaps we can also ask if the audience would like to ask questions directly, but this is the last question someone has dropped for you. It says, there is really no RCN kernel price mismatch. High kernel prices in West Africa compensates for the high processing costs there, while the proximity of Cambodia to an efficient Vietnam allows for lower prices. What is your take on this?
What is my take? What is my take? Well, higher prices for kernels in West Africa are a relatively recent development. We've really only seen that happen since, I would say, April 2021 in any sustained fashion. The higher prices in West Africa reflect a number of things. They reflect location and distance to market. They reflect the cost, in other words, the freight. They reflect certain factors such as traceability, transparency, reliability, certification. So these are factors contributing to higher prices for cashew kernels in West Africa. There is also a motivation among some buyers to help develop the African sector to reduce their dependence on Vietnam as their major supplier. We saw earlier 89% dependence on the US and 77% in the European Union. It is logical that if you're located closer to market, have lower costs, that you will be more competitive. It is logical that you should receive a higher price if you offer additional factors. On the other hand, it's also quite logical that Vietnam processes the raw material that's close at hand. Having said that, if the factories don't exist, as they didn't in West Africa until relatively recently, and as they don't today in Cambodia, the nuts have to move. And this is the revolution, I suppose, that we're seeing, is competitive factories. So it's not just a case of building factories. We saw that 30 years ago. We saw it in the 1980s in East Africa. It's building competitive, well-managed factories that market a product in a way that meets the buyer's requirements. So my take on it is that it is far more logical that African cashews are processed in Africa and that Asian cashews are processed in Asia, along the lines of closer to the origin. And the more we look at cost, environmental impact, and sustainability factors, the clearer that becomes. So what's happening now is that the gap, which is efficient, cost-effective processing in African countries, that gap is being tackled. Time will tell whether that's successful or not.
Thank you very much, Jim. I'm still checking the time to ensure that we don't move over. I'm just checking to see if there is any hand up. I don't see any hand up. So while probably wait if somebody would have a question to ask, Jim, what should we be expecting in the coming days leading on to the next GME?
I think over the next 2 weeks, we probably will see a relatively quiet period in terms of market movement. I don't see kernels buyers coming to the market in any major fashion in the short term. Probably we'll see a bit more trade on raw cashew nuts, especially from Guinea-Bissau, Senegal region. Look out for, if we do see kernels buyers come to the market, look out for a bounce on prices in Vietnam. I don't think that necessarily would affect African kernels prices because they are already at levels well above Vietnam. I'd be very interested to see the export figures for the first half of June from Vietnam and the import figures in the US and Europe for April and May. And if those figures are positive, I think we can then probably confirm that demand will be up in 2022. So relatively quiet period, but some interesting events nonetheless.
Thank you very much, Jim. There are no further questions or anybody wanting to ask direct questions. So can we bring the session to an end now? I think we can.
Thanks very much, Blessing. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time and attending today. It's been my pleasure to talk to you again.
Thank you very much, Jim. And a big thanks also to the two people that joined us today. That's Madam Minata Kone from Sotriabi and Herman Abiona. Thank you very much to our participants also for joining us, not just today, but every 2 weeks when we come online, you join us. And to our partners and sponsors who have continually supported this project. I'm looking at GIZ Move, Intersnack, EdSenai, CNFA Pro Cashew, TechnoServe Benin Cashew, and many more. I would also like to inform all of us that the 16th ACA Annual Cashew Conference will be held in Abuja, Nigeria, and the date is from the 12th to the 15th of September. Registration has started, and we entreat you all to go onto the website, which is acaliveevents.com. acaliveevents.com. Go onto the website, register, and get amazing discounts. We hope to see you in Abuja September, and we hope that you join us again for the next GME on the 29th of June. Until then, take care and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
The African Cashew Alliance ACA presents to you the 16th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo. This year's edition will be held from the 12th to the 15th of September 2022 at the Sheraton Abuja Hotel, Abuja, Nigeria. Theme: Strengthening Sustainable Kernel and Byproduct Marketing in the African Cashew Industry. Join cashew industry players and development partners across the globe, physically or virtually, for insightful plenaries, presentations, and panel discussions from cashew experts across the globe. Visit www.acalifeevents.com to register.
L'Alliance pour le cajou africain ACA vous présente la 16e conférence et exposition annuelle sur le cajou. L'édition de cette année se tiendra du 12 au 15 septembre à Sheraton Abuja Hotel situé à Abuja, au Nigeria. Sous le thème « Renforcer le marketing durable des amandes et des produits dérivés dans l'industrie africaine de la noix de cajou », rejoignez les acteurs de l'industrie du cajou et les partenaires de développement du monde entier, soit en présentiel ou virtuellement pour assister à des séances plénières, des présentations et des débats d'experts du cajou du monde entier.
The African Cashew Alliance ACA presents to you the 16th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo. This year's edition will be held from the 12th to the 15th of September 2022 at the Sheraton Abuja Hotel, Abuja, Nigeria. Theme: Strengthening Sustainable Kernel and Byproduct Marketing in the African Cashew Industry. Join cashew industry players
porter soleil.
Sergio, Sergio,
ben arrivé tout bon, nom blanc Jackmon.
Sergio, Sergio, ben arrivé.
Passez bancaille nom blanc, nous prenez belle trois fées.
Sergio, Sergio,
ben arrivé Tibay, aïe fout moins content. Sorti à tête foyale moins du nom blanc débarqué.
Sergio, Sergio, ben arrivé.
Ben arrivé, aïe nous ja swingé.
Sergio, Sergio, ben arrivé.
Ben arrivé, yeppa, ou ba nous les news.
Sergio, Sergio, ben arrivé.
Nom blanc arrivé, aïe moins content. J'ai mon tombé. Woy, woy, woy. Non blanc, pas l'épée.